Welcome to the Calm Analytics channel. I'm Boris Tezenghausen. Today is November 28th and we have a packed episode ahead. So, maniacs, cannibals and murderers. Who in Russia was released from prison to fight in the war against Ukraine? How did I open Pandora's box while researching this topic? And drones have paid a visit to Kadyrov. What's happening in his golden palace? Why haven't we heard anything about him for so long? Putin has finally come up with an excuse for why he won't sign a peace agreement. Meanwhile, Russians are being jailed for their social media posts, while serial killers are being awarded medals. Matvienko suddenly remembered, believe it or not, about American humanitarian aid and Bush's chicken legs, and even claimed that the US supposedly wanted to poison Russian citizens with those chicken legs. And we'll recall how, at the dawn of his career in the 1990s, Putin robbed the residents of St. Petersburg. The Kremlin is luring foreigners into the war with new methods, and now the internet in Russia already works by whitelists. In other words, the first step toward digital barracks has been taken. We'll talk about this and more in today's episode. There's going to be a lot of interesting stuff. If this is your first time on this channel, welcome. Subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. So a bit later, there will probably be some shocking information about what kinds of maniacs and what kind of scum have been dragged out from the darkest places, from Russian prisons to sent to Ukraine. But first, I wanted to say literally a sentence or two about Putin's speech yesterday, where he finally came up with an excuse, well, not really came up with, but used an old one, about why he simply can't, in any way, sign any peace agreement, whether it's out of 28 points or 20. In general, to spare your nerves, I won't show his speech here. Everything he said can literally be summed up in one sentence. He didn't come up with anything new and said, "I can't sign the agreement because the current leadership of Ukraine is illegitimate." He started saying something about how, according to the constitution, a certain number of terms is not allowed. This is coming from Putin, who bent the constitution to his will and has already extended his own terms indefinitely. Well, in general, everything is clear here, and this was to be expected. Basically, the bald-headed fraud is slacking off again. He could at least come up with something new, but it's all the same old stuff. And yesterday, it turns out, drones flew to Kadyrov. They sent him greetings from Ukraine, flew into Grozny, and struck one of the military bases. And since nothing has been heard about Kadyrov for a long time, I thought maybe something good really happened. I checked his Telegram channel, and absolutely nothing has changed there. He's either opening or building yet another golden skyscraper with Russian taxpayers' money, or some UFC champion has come to visit him. Apparently, they paid him no less than 10 million so he would take a photo with Kadyrov and his entourage. In short, Kadyrov is living his best life, all at the expense of Russian taxpayers. The only thing is, of course, he doesn't look so great anymore. He started to look like some kind of Winnie the Pooh, barely able to move, and is clearly grooming his son Adam as his successor. Not a single video now goes by without his son in it. This little Brezhnev, judging by the number of orders and medals, is always present nearby with some mysterious smile. Actually, by now, his son should have been given a medal for not having received a medal in a long time. They're slacking off. And here's a piece of news. News like this comes in literally every day that really shows how terribly Putin is afraid of his own people. Just recently, I talked about how Ural Airlines flight attendant Varvara Volkova was sentenced to 7 years in prison for her anti-war stance simply because she dared to say that her friends in Ukraine had been killed by those ghouls whom people in Russia consider heroes. And here's another piece of news. A Muscovite, Salim Kamin, was sentenced to 8 years in a penal colony. Guess what for? For anti-war posts and comments. The prosecutor actually asked for a 9.5 years, so you see 10 years for a comment. Murderers in Russia get less, but we'll get to the murderers in a moment. That's a complete horror show. So, he was detained for a post about a missile strike on an apartment building in Uman, which is in the Cherkasy region here in Ukraine, and the information from his comments was considered military fakes. So, a strike on a high-rise building in Uman is considered a military fake. Let me remind you, this event happened on April 28th, 2023. Let's take a look at this so-called fake. This is what it looks like, this fake. According to the Russians, The strike on this residential building happened at 4:20 in the morning. I want to draw special attention to the fact that the strike happened at 4 a.m. when everyone in the building was asleep. Elderly people, children, everyone was at home. The missile hit a 9-story building and the number of casualties was 23 people, including 6 children. How could anyone have survived here if the Russian K-101 missile destroyed half the building? As a rule, Russia carries out massive shelling of Ukraine at night. There are Telegram channels that warn about possible redeployment of strategic aviation. Ukrainians read these Telegram channels and understand that there is a high likelihood of shelling at night. I always provide these details so that those who think it's time to stop helping Ukraine, who believe the war is far away, can understand. No, it's actually very close to you, really close to Europe. Imagine coming home from work, checking a Telegram channel, and realizing that you might have to grab your child, your cat, your dog in the middle of the night and run to the subway if you live in a big city. If the subway is far, then to the basement or an underground parking lot. And there are places where there is neither a shelter nor a parking lot. So you just sit at home and hope that nothing will hit you, just like people in Uman were hoping to. And there is no place in Ukraine where a Russian missile can't reach. Millions of people have become hostages to a maniac, a madman. For the sake of some illusory goals, he kills his own citizens and the citizens of Ukraine. The most interesting thing is that Putin actually came to power after the apartment bombings in Russia. So that building in Uman that I showed, Putin blew up buildings in his own country even worse, in Buynaksk, in Moscow, in Volgodonsk. And every time I will remind you about this, about the Ryazan sugar, Putin came to power on the bombings of his own apartment buildings. And together with Patrushev, they were also blowing up apartment buildings at night in Russia to justify the Chechen war and bring this bald mug to power. By the way, he killed more than 300 Russians with those bombings. And a little later, the Kursk submarine incident happened. Remember, it sank. That's a lie. It's amazing he wasn't just taken out back then. When I was preparing this episode, I accidentally opened Pandora's box. We're now moving on to a topic that honestly made my hair stand on end. But this is Russia. Because I touched on the topic, who is actually going to fight for Putin, and who have the Russian prisons spewed out from their depths, from their dark depths? Who have they sent to war? Let's start with the fact that in Russia now, you can be pardoned even for serious crimes, for multiple murders, without a trial. Just by a Putin pardon. Well, this could happen before, but now it's happening on an industrial scale. You could be the bloodiest maniac in Russian history, but if you go to war against Ukraine, all charges against you will be dropped. Fight a little, and the charges are gone. Let me start with some simple cases. For example, just recently, a court dropped the case against an officer who shot a conscript at a training ground. This officer simply went off to fight in the war with Ukraine. This case was heard in the Ussurisk garrison court. So what happened? A conscript named Artyom Antonov was shot dead. First, he was beaten and abused because he refused to go fight in Ukraine and refused to sign a contract. An officer named Yemelyanov just shot him for no reason. He didn't want to go to Ukraine, so the officer shot him. In the end, the criminal case wasn't even shown to anyone, not even to his close relatives. That's it. It later became known that the one who shot him went off to fight in Ukraine. This is just the tip of the iceberg, probably the most basic case. By the way, in St. Petersburg, a group of prisoners who had been selected to be sent to fight in Ukraine killed the driver of the prison transport vehicle and escaped. Good for those prisoners. They didn't go to war. They were being taken straight from prison to the front lines. So, just so you understand, this is really something. It's like a Hollywood movie, with the most vicious, the most unhinged people, they're being taken to the front by bus. By the way, Russian experts are already noting that after the war ends, it would be best to just stay home in Russia because a wave of crime will hit. Those whom the Kremlin pulled out of prison for the sake of the war will either die at the front, but if they survive, they'll return to Russia with weapons, with trauma, with PTSD. Their incomes will drop sharply, their wives will be very, very unhappy, and their families will be very unhappy. And then there are these unhinged individuals who have been through prison and gained experience in killing. If someone didn't have that experience before, they got it during the war. It's like the film The Cold Summer of 1953, when after Stalin's death, an amnesty was declared and a huge number of criminals were released. The film The Cold Summer of 1953 will seem a children's cartoon compared to what awaits Russia after this war. The most terrible thing about this war is that Ukraine is losing its best sons and daughters, while Russia is sending this kind of scum, human garbage, who go to kill just to get their sentences reduced. In fact, everyone who goes to kill in Ukraine is human garbage. I can't find any other word for it. And let me remind you, friends, that we have an important fundraiser in every episode. Right now, we're raising funds to repair equipment for the legendary Freedom of Russia Legion, which is fighting for Ukraine against all this evil. They are currently stationed in the Pokrovsky direction as well. The Legionnaires and Caesar have recorded a message for us and for you. Please take a look.
Честь имею. Мы, бойцы Легиона Свобода России, обращаемся к зрителям канала Бориса Тизенгаузена. На фронте машина – это жизнь. Это наш шанс добраться до своих, подвести боеприпасы и эвакуировать раненых. Но каждый день мы теряем машину из-за дронов, обстрелов и мин. Сейчас нам нужны средства, чтобы наши колеса снова крутились. Каждый донат – это шанс выжить и бороться дальше. За свободу, за правду.
Friends, let's help the defenders of Ukraine. Believe me, they need our help now more than ever. The bald jellyfish is twitching in agony, throwing everything it can into these meat assaults. But our fighters, the defenders of Ukraine, are holding the line. And let's help them. Equipment there is worth its weight in gold right now. The link to donate is in the description of this video. There you'll find all the details for those who want to help from Ukraine and for those who want to help from abroad. And from me personally to each of you, I always say a huge thank you for supporting Ukraine, for supporting our warriors. Together we are a great force, believe me. If you don't see the details in the description, maybe you're watching on another channel. Look for the QR code, you can use that too. Let's help the Legionnaires. Well, and here comes the heavy artillery. Maniacs, sadists, and cannibals whom Putin pardoned because they went to kill in Ukraine. When I was reading about it, without going into details, obviously there might be sensitive viewers watching us here. Alexander Tyutin, who ordered the contract killing of a family of 4, including 2 children aged 11 and 15, he was recruited by Wagner PMC right from prison. After fighting, he received awards and a pardon from Putin. Now he's a hero, apparently, and has already returned. In Kurgan, a former mercenary who returned from the front, Andrei Frolov, was detained. A criminal case has been opened. He assaulted a 9-year-old girl, a second-grade student. Before that, before the war, he had been repeatedly convicted for similar crimes. He has a murder and car theft on his record, insulting police officers, and so on. In 2022, while serving yet another sentence, he signed a contract and went to war. 6 months later, in 2023, he returned and received a pardon from Putin. A resident of the Sakhalin region, Denis Gorin, is accused of murdering at least 4 people and of cannibalism. He was released from the penal colony where he had served 2 years of his sentence and went to fight in Ukraine. So look, 4 murders, cannibalism, and he gets 22 years. Meanwhile, you get 8 years for an anti-war post. So together with his brother, they killed 4 people. This is just some kind of savagery. At least 4 murders have been proven. Locals say there could be many more victims. So basically, he both killed a person and ate him. And now all this filth and rot has been sent to the front to atone for their sins. And then it will return to Russia. There are dozens of such stories. The murderer of 34-year-old Irina Sinelnikova from Berdsk was released after 4 years, having served 6 months in the Wagner PMC. The murderers from Obninsk came back, changed their names, and are now heroes with medals. So there are plenty of stories like this. Take Igor Safonov, for example, a mass murderer of 6 people, and attention, this happened after he returned from the front. Before the war, he had been repeatedly convicted of serious crimes. He was enlisted in the Wagner PMC and returned pardoned. After coming back, together with an accomplice, he killed 6 people in Karelia. Well, mercenary Artyom Saikev, who had been convicted 9 times after returning from Ukrainian captivity, was once again sentenced for murder. He had 9 sentences before the war, came back from captivity, and beat a pensioner to death. And here's another one, Ivan Rosomakin, a murderer. You know what's interesting here? This one was pardoned twice. He killed, served time at first, got recruited, went to fight in Ukraine, came back, killed, was pardoned, then went to the front again, and so on. It's a whole cycle. So he was pardoned twice. Can you imagine that? Then these cases are not isolated. There are hundreds of such cases. And the system hides these cases. They are being covered up. They've been ordered not to talk about it. After all, these are the so-called heroes of this special military operation. Well, basically, yes. There you have all of Russia. There you have the face of Russia. There you have a Russia that won't be able to offer anything good in the near future. Believe me, if this Putin dies, you won't even notice how some replicant will take his place, or a little Putin or Kabaev Jr. will grow up. And everything will start all over again. That's why Kaja Kallas is right. Reduce the Russian army, deprive it of its military budget, pull out its sting in the form of nuclear weapons, and ideally fragment Russia into smaller territories so that it no longer poses a threat. But it's not just Putin. He also has a cohort of mothballed toads around him. Matvienko is just, well, she's the textbook example of a mothballed Komsomol member. So, she recently remembered, big shout out to the USA coming up, she recently recalled that the US sent humanitarian aid in the 1990s in order, get this, to destroy the Russian economy. The Americans used humanitarian aid to ruin the already barely breathing Russian economy, said Federation Council Speaker Matvienko in an interview with Moskovsky Komsomolets. Well, this is just something else entirely. The Komsomol members froze in amber. And do you know what she said? Do you really think they were sending us those bush legs, those chicken quarters, out of the goodness of their hearts? No, they were undermining our agriculture, destroying our poultry farms, sending us products that were cheaper than ours. That's how they killed our economy. Oh my God. And she even added that the US was harming the health of Russians because those chicken legs were soaked with antibiotics and all sorts of nasty stuff. They're honestly just out of their minds. Back then, they gave you the only source of cheap protein so you wouldn't just starve to death. Because it was exactly these kinds of Komsomol members, like that toad Matvienko, who managed the planned economy and the war in Afghanistan so badly that there was simply nothing left to eat. At that time, the US supplied about 1 million tons of chicken meat. And this was a humanitarian aid program that Russia itself requested. Do you understand? Because otherwise there would have been mass hunger riots in industrial cities, and that would have been the end of it. That was the time when they shouldn't have supplied anything. There would have been riots, and through those riots, the regions that were part of this prison of nations would have broken away. Maybe Russia would be smaller now. As they say, let's make Russia small again. Humanitarian aid is a good thing, Putin said about those chicken legs. And imagine, that clown also used to criticize those chicken legs at one point. And now I'll tell you why I'm so outraged. Humanitarian aid is a good thing, Putin said. It arrived, and our domestic producers died out because they couldn't sell their products. The flip side of what seemed like good intentions, as Putin stated, But Putin forgot how he used to steal through supply schemes in St. Petersburg. In St. Petersburg, he would just snatch things up, as he puts it. So really, Putin would be better off keeping quiet about humanitarian aid and food supplies. Just because Putin doesn't use the internet doesn't mean that information about the so-called St. Petersburg scheme hasn't been preserved online. Let me remind you in just a couple of sentences. In 1991 to 1992, Putin headed the Committee for External Relations of the St. Petersburg mayor's office, and dozens of contracts went through him. The scheme was as follows. St. Petersburg would send raw materials, timber, metals, oil, abroad, and in return it was supposed to receive food supplies. The problem was that the raw materials were sent abroad, but the food never arrived in St. Petersburg. The contracts were personally signed by Putin. All these documents are available online with his signature. In some cases, he even signed them without any coordination. The companies involved, the intermediaries, were shell companies, many of which were connected to criminal groups, including the Tambov gang with whom Putin was close. Well, basically, it was a classic scheme. The raw materials were gone, the money was gone, and the food disappeared along the way. Then there was an investigation. The commission demanded that Putin be removed from his post, that the materials be handed over to the prosecutor's office, and that an investigation be conducted. At that time, Yuri Boldyrev, the head of the audit chamber, confirmed all these manipulations and violations. But Mayor Sobchak covered for him. Sobchak, the one for whom Putin used to carry suitcases, still covered for that Botox maggot back then. So basically, at that time, Putin was simply exporting resources out of Russia. And he didn't bring in any food, just blatantly cheated the residents of St. Petersburg. A textbook scumbag. But he doesn't like American chicken legs, though. But Matvienko not only knows how to criticize American chicken legs, she also knows how to get work done. The Federation Council, where Matvienko is the chairwoman, has approved raising VAT to 22% in Russia starting next year. So, there you have it, Russians. You'll have to pay even more for this war. Well, as they say, we'll live badly, but not for long. By the way, so that Russians don't get too upset, by next spring they'll start isolating the Russian internet and leave only approved websites, and of course the state messenger Max. But an internet with only approved sites and blocked unwanted messengers is also needed because, for Putin, the most dangerous people will actually be those returning from the front with medals and decorations from this shameful war. Well, hypothetically, some so-called hero of the so-called special military operation who suddenly decides to play the role of a second Prigozhin. Could that happen? It absolutely could. He could return to his hometown with its broken roads, corrupt officials, bureaucrats, and cops, and decide to play the role of a people's hero. What's going on over there? Moscow is living high on the hog. In general, since Putin loves history so much, let him study the time of troubles. I think something even worse awaits Russia. By the way, friends, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Here, we not only fight against Russian propaganda, but also expose the lies of people like Putin and Matvienko. And no matter how many hundreds of millions Putin spends on his propaganda, it's not really working out for him. If the propaganda actually worked as it should, there wouldn't be any need to cut Russians off from the internet. By the way, that's direct proof that Russian propaganda isn't working all that well anymore. So subscribe, let's see how many of us are still sane. Here's a piece of news I just couldn't ignore. The prosecutor's office of the Russian Federation has called the high intelligence of a physicist accused of treason an aggravating circumstance. This is about the case of Artem Koroshilov, a physicist from the Moscow region. The prosecution stated that the defendant's high intelligence aggravates his guilt. With his high intelligence, he deliberately used his knowledge and skills to undermine the security of his own country. Well, this physicist is being accused of hacking, but his colleagues have their doubts because one of them said in a conversation that this physicist could barely program at all. But the very news that high intelligence is considered an aggravating circumstance, I think this needs to be scaled up to all of Russia. Now, throughout all of Russia, high intelligence is considered an aggravating circumstance. And here's a related piece of news. Putin's dissertation advisor has proposed closing 2/3 of universities in Russia, so that there won't be high intelligence, which is now considered an aggravating circumstance. So the rector of St. Petersburg Mining University, Vladimir Litvinenko, who in 1997 was Putin's dissertation advisor, said that the number of universities should be reduced by at least 3 times, and that engineering diplomas should only be awarded after 3 years of mandatory work in industry. Right now, there's a brewing scandal in Russia among medical students who suddenly had a decision made for them to bring back mandatory job placement like in the Soviet Union. Wherever the state sends you, that's where you'll work. But it's no coincidence that it was Litvinenko who voiced this idea. He is Putin's trusted person in the academic sphere. His words are not just a personal opinion, but a way to test Russian society's reaction to a future Kremlin decision. They're not just bringing it back for medical students. Mandatory job placement will be reinstated for everyone. They will send you wherever the state orders. And here's another piece of news. The scale of the campaign to recruit foreigners into the Russian army has increased more than 7-fold. They're recruiting from Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, African countries, Kenyans, from Nepal, Indians, South Africans, basically from nearly 100 countries. In 4 years of war against Ukraine, they've already thrown 18,000 foreigners into the meat grinder. Moreover, in recent months this year, recruiters have become much more active. They analyzed advertising content aimed at foreign countries and found out that huge budgets are being spent on campaigns to attract citizens from other countries to the war. So that's really how it is. So what do we have here? Putin, who says, yes, we can fight forever, is cutting payments to contract soldiers. In some regions, payments to contract soldiers have been cut 3-fold. They've now cancelled death benefits. They're trying in every possible way to lure foreigners into this war. So it turns out that yesterday Putin, who claimed that we are ready to fight as long as needed, to put it mildly, was once again talking nonsense. By the way, he was once again standing there, making statements, rocking back and forth on his heels. He seems to have some kind of special ritual with those heels. He makes statements and rocks back and forth. Sometimes I feel like he's just rehearsing how quickly he can dash to the luggage room. Like if things suddenly get dangerous, he's rocking to build up momentum so he can just, boom, he'll bolt down the corridor, losing his heels if there's any kind of commotion. So he's basically practicing. And to make sure the common folk, God forbid, don't put 2 and 2 together and check the internet, don't watch Tizengausen's channel, they really need to shut down the internet completely. And in the Belgorod and Rostov regions, they're already starting to test internet access using white lists of approved sites. So they only allow access to approved sites, and that's it. Nothing else. Yes, for now it was only for half a day, but the test is currently for half a day. By the way, if you didn't know, in some regions of Russia, they cut off mobile internet back in the summer. They said it would last until the end of the war. And when will the war end? That will be announced on the approved whitelisted sites. The Bol Chupacabra decided not to wait until people on the internet started complaining and asking why all of this was even necessary. Just cut off the internet, shut it down, and that's it. Well, friends, take care of yourselves, take care of your loved ones, believe in Ukraine's victory, subscribe to this channel, and let's help the legendary legionnaires and Caesar. Just a reminder, the link to the fundraiser is in the description of this video. Wishing us all a peaceful day and glory to Ukraine.